On the 16th of February 2021, YouTuber The Kavernacle, to whom I will refer as TK for convenience, and I hope he doesn't mind, uploaded a video entitled The Anti-Japanese Racism and Orientalism of Cyberpunk, from Blade Runner to Cyberpunk 2077. Early on in his video, he modestly acknowledged his limitations and invited critique, saying, quote, "I'm not so familiar with everything, so if you want to inform me on cyberpunk stuff I've never talked about, or stuff that you feel is very influential, and I've, had a big oversight on it, please let me know in the comments," end quote. I took him up on this, writing a page-long comment explaining some of his mistaken views on cyberpunk beneath a third cyberpunk video he uploaded on the 4th of October 2023. I didn't receive a response, but I didn't really expect one, given that there were already hundreds of comments, and it's most likely he never saw mine. However, having watched all three of TK's videos, which cover the history of cyberpunk in general and the 1982 movie Blade Runner in particular, and having seen quite a few other videos on YouTube with really inaccurate accounts of the history of both subjects, I thought I would finally address this issue myself. All three of TK's videos on cyberpunk contain significant errors of fact and rely heavily on highly anachronistic understandings of history and cyberpunk. To be fair, many of his mistakes are long-standing pop history myths which can be found repeated in many print and online commentaries on cyberpunk and Blade Runner, including in academic publications, so it's not a matter of him being uniquely wrong on this or particularly ignorant. These myths are so widespread, it really is hard to locate accurate sources and identify the facts, and it's incredibly easy to be misinformed. What's really interesting to me is just how much of this mythology emerged in the mid-1990s, long after the original Blade Runner movie was released. It was in the 90s that various new interpretations of Blade Runner became established, such as the false claim that it represented a panicked American response to fears of Japanese technological success, economic superiority, and corporate takeover. In reality, when Blade Runner was first shown in 1982, it was dismissed by disappointed audience members who didn't think it was relevant to current events, and condemned by film critics who regarded it as a badly made and very boring mashup of the sci-fi and film noir detective genres. Blade Runner wasn't even originally written, marketed, or understood as a cyberpunk movie. In fact, the earliest commentary I can find identifying Blade Runner as cyberpunk dates to 1987, 5 years after its release. The true history of Blade Runner has been considerably retconned. So how did all this mythology emerge? That's quite a story which will take me several videos to cover. In this first video, I'll identify some errors in TK's explanation of cyberpunk's origin, and identify many of the related errors in his analysis of Blade Runner 1982. If you don't want to watch all of this, use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Cyberpunk isn't based on Western fears of Japan. In his first Cyberpunk video, TK repeats a long-standing interpretation of Cyberpunk's origin, writing, quote, "Since the 1980s, since Blade Runner came out, there's been a strong infusion with Western cyberpunk and Asian culture, but it gets very problematic due to the fact that it is made by Westerners, and it is really showing the fears of Westerners when they make this stuff, and cyberpunk stories are about dystopias, meaning you pretty much do not want to live in these places, and I think it's pretty telling that these dystopias depict certain cultures in Asia a certain way," end quote. TK traces cyberpunk's supposed fear of Asia generally and Japan specifically back to the English science fiction author Philip K. Dick, whose 1968 novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was the source material for the 1982 movie Blade Runner. TK asserts that Dick's 1962 novel, The Man in the High Castle, already reflected American fears of a Japanese invasion and Japanese control of the US. He says, quote, "If we look at something like Man in the High Castle, it is set also in California, and it's about a world in the 1960s where the Axis won World War II and California is now controlled by Japan. Now, I like the TV show a lot, and I like this book a lot, but what it does do is show a society that Americans were fearing. If Japan came to America and imposed itself on the Americans, what would that look like?" End quote. I don't know how he reached this conclusion because he doesn't provide any explanation for it, nor does he cite any sources. We'll find this is a common feature of TK's videos on cyberpunk. He makes a claim, doesn't explain how he reached this conclusion, and doesn't cite any evidence for it. There are times when he does explain himself, and there are times when he does cite sources, but there are often serious problems with those also, as we'll see. In reality, Dick's inspiration for The Man in the High Castle came from a completely different source. In a book chapter entitled Philip K. Dick and Philosophy, Do Androids Have Kindred Spirits?, in the 2011 book The Day Roosevelt Was Assassinated, Peter Simons, Professor Emeritus of Moral Philosophy at Trinity College, writes, quote, Dick was influenced by the example of Ward Moore's 1953 novel Bring the Jubilee, an alternate history which starts with the Confederate States of America winning the Battle of Gettysburg and the American Civil War, the hinge event being the successful Confederate capture of Little Round Top in the battle, end quote. Dick's ex-wife, Anne R. Dick, in her 2010 book The Search for Philip K. Dick, wrote, quote, Phil had suggested that I read Ward Moore's novel Bring the Jubilee. I borrowed it from the library and read it with delight. Bring the Jubilee is an alternate reality world in which the South has won the Civil War, end quote. She recounts posing the question to Dick, quote, I wish Ward Moore had developed that fascinating idea further. I wonder what that world was like, end quote, adding, quote, It wasn't long after this that Phil started working on his new novel, which was set in a universe where Japan and Nazi Germany had won World War II, end quote. So already we can see that TK is wrong about the origin of Cyberpunk and the earliest source material of Blade Runner. In a later video in this series, I'll explain in detail the real origin of Cyberpunk as a genre, but now I'll address TK's claims about the motivation behind the 1982 Blade Runner movie. Blade Runner 1982 isn't based on Western fears of Japan. In addition to The Man in the High Castle, TK has specific reasons for believing that Blade Runner 1982, often seen as a landmark cyberpunk movie, represents fears of the US economy being taken over by Japanese corporations. This is seen in his first video, in which he says, quote, The first Blade Runner reflects the Western fears of a Japanese takeover, end quote. Helpfully, he cites a source for this claim in his first video, saying, quote, There's a really good article that I read today which I want to share for you, just to outline why Blade Runner is influenced by these fears of Japan taking over the global economy, which you can see visually in the film, end quote. He quotes the same source in his first and second video, and he quotes from it almost identically in both cases, but I'll quote his second video since it's more explicit. TK says, quote, In the 1980s, it was strongly believed that Japan would become the new capitalist hegemonic power, and there was a lot of anger and resentment in the US because they'd believed that they'd propped Japan up, they had rebuilt Japan after World War II, and now Japan was stabbing them in the back by flooding the US market with consumer electronics, end quote. Adding, quote, What the original Blade Runner has is showing the xenophobic fears of the Japanese takeover of the world, end quote. He also says, quote, Basically, there was a lot of suspicion of Japanese corporations, like they were all an arm of the Japanese state, and they were trying to get revenge for World War II. Like, people actually did believe this at the time, and you can kind of see that xenophobia and that fear in cyberpunk as a whole, including the first Blade Runner, end quote. It's great that he cites the article to which he refers, but unfortunately, it's not a very good article. It's from the Foundation for Economic Education and entitled 80s Fears of a Japanese Economic Pearl Harbor Look Silly Today, but they're instructive. The Foundation for Economic Education is a right-wing libertarian think tank with a politically, culturally, and economically conservative free market capitalist position, and is funded heavily by the infamous Charles Koch Institute. We should anticipate from this that its view of economic history in the US will consequently be very biased. That doesn't mean it's not a useful source for TK's argument, or that the article can simply be dismissed out of hand or ignored. The article certainly does provide some definite facts about the 1980s, and they do appear at least superficially relevant to TK's argument. However, the article also has a very biased view on economics and distorts the history it describes, a fact TK seems completely unaware of. TK quotes the article saying that during the 1960s, the US government made trade agreements with Japan which were extremely favorable to Japanese industry, giving Japan a significant advantage in the global economy. This is true. Ironically, TK does not understand that this contradicts his own argument because the original novel on which Blade Runner was based, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, was written in 1967, just after these trade agreements had been made. This means that the novel was written in an economic and political climate which was very positive towards Japan, the complete opposite of the paranoid xenophobia which TK attributes to Blade Runner. TK also seems totally unaware that in the novel there is no mention at all of Japan, China, or even Asia. So it's very difficult to argue the novel was motivated by any xenophobic fears of Japanese takeover, whether of the US or of the world. In fact, I'm not even sure if TK is aware of the novel's actual content. But what of the movie Blade Runner itself? That was released in 1982, after which the economic climate was quite different. TK cites the article observing that in 1980, US President Ronald Reagan had become concerned by a trade deficit caused by Japanese car imports, and in his presidential campaign, he said something needed to be done about this. Specifically, Reagan said, quote, "Japan is part of the problem. This is where government can be legitimately involved. That is, to convince the Japanese in one way or another that, in their own interests, that deluge of cars must be slowed while our industry gets back on its feet." End quote. That looks more like what TK was talking about, but this is where the article's exaggeration starts. We should already note that at this point in 1980, there was no widespread panic, even in the government, of a Japanese economic takeover of the world or even the US economy, still less a Japanese corporate takeover of America. There was just some concern from Reagan over a trade deficit caused by Japanese car imports. And what happened? Well, the US proposed a tariff on Japanese cars, the Japanese government agreed, and the situation was promptly defused. There was no extended trade war or tariff battle. That wouldn't come until years later in the 1980s. Let's look a little closer. The final version of the Blade Runner script was completed in February 1981, so it's entirely possible that it could have been influenced by Reagan's trade deficit worries. However, even in 1980, the idea that Japanese car imports were a problem was a controversial idea in US politics, which many politicians, even in Reagan's own party, disputed. This is never mentioned in the article TK cites, very likely because it's a libertarian think tank article and it is motivated to depict the US government as having a monolithic view and as being both wrong and incompetent. TK should not be relying on such a biased source for an understanding of American economic history. In fact, by 1981, Reagan's own cabinet was seriously split over the issue of whether or not to support Reagan's proposed restrictions on Japanese car imports. Of course, TK's source never mentions this due to its bias, and TK himself seems totally unaware of it. That's why it's important to validate sources before using them. The relationship between US and Japanese car manufacturers was also far more complex than TK describes, and certainly much more complex than is described in the article he cites. A 22nd of August 1982 article in the New York Times entitled "For American Auto Industry, Japan is Both Enemy and Friend" explained that some of the largest US car manufacturers were at that time heavily dependent on business partnerships with Japanese car companies, which either made parts for them or sold them entire cars. The article described American car manufacturer Ford installing Japanese-made manual transmissions in its Ford Escort, and noted the Ford Laser, quote, "is basically a Mazda GLC," end quote. The article cites Chrysler deliberately using marketing phrases such as, quote, "master car builders in Japan," end quote, in order to sell imported cars it bought from Mitsubishi, and cites General Motors' plans to, quote, "import cars from Isuzu and Suzuki," end quote, as well as, quote, "an agreement for joint production of a Toyota-designed car in one of its closed West Coast assembly plants," end quote. This is the complete opposite of a xenophobic American car industry encouraging racist fears about a Japanese takeover of the American economy. On the Japanese side, there were also strong calls for cooperation. A number of Japanese car companies actually started opening production facilities in the US, avoiding trade tariffs and shipping fees, reducing costs, and providing new employment opportunities for US workers. A 21st of March 1982 New York Times article observed, quote, In Japan, Toyota has been criticized for not placing a large production facility in America. It is thought here that new jobs would help warm the trade relations with the United States." End quote. None of these real-world complexities are even mentioned in the libertarian article cited by TK, nor does his own commentary on the topic indicate any understanding of the actual economic realities at the time, still less the social response to them at the elite and non-elite levels in the US. At the time that the Blade Runner script was being written, and even the year that the movie was released in 1982, the fear of Japanese economic influence on the US economy was still restricted to US political party debates over Japanese car imports. This is nothing like the claims TK makes about the US fearing Japan, quote, "flooding the US market with consumer electronics," end quote, and nothing like his claim of, quote, "xenophobic fears of the Japanese takeover of the world," end quote. Of course, if you've seen the movie itself, you'll realize it doesn't show anything which looks like the US has become flooded with Japanese consumer electronics. In fact, Japanese companies have almost no presence in the movie whatsoever. I have found only 2 real and 2 fictional Japanese companies which are identifiably and distinctly named, though some fictional Japanese companies appear for a few seconds in the background of an establishing shot, and they're typically small-scale restaurants and other minor retail stores, certainly not international megacorporations. We'll see this in the next section of this video. TK also quotes the article talking about what Japanese companies were doing with the money they earned from their imports, such as, quote, "buy assets like the Mobil Building in New York in 1987, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in 1988, and the Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan in 1989, end quote. This might seem like the kind of action which could stir up xenophobic American fears of a Japanese takeover, but neither the article nor TK provides any evidence that's what happened. TK himself tells us these purchases took place in 1987, 1988, and 1989, so it was not possible for any of them to have influenced the script and production of Blade Runner. These purchases took place 5 to 7 years after the movie had already been released in 1982. TK cites the Foundation for Economic Freedom article describing even more increasingly wild fears of Japanese economic dominance as expressed by the US media and politicians, including concerns of a trade war and, quote, "economic Pearl Harbor," end quote. But again, these are dated by the article itself to no earlier than 1985, and some of them to as late as 1988. To reinforce the point even further, it is at this late stage in the 1980s when media actually did start reflecting the US-Japanese trade war. For example, a 1988 comic book called Iron Man Crash was described by a reviewer as, quote, "a kind of cyberpunk science fiction set in a future where Japan and the US are having an information technology Cold War," end quote. So it's very easy to detect when the US-Japanese trade war really did start influencing popular media, and when it did so, the message was completely explicit. The sheer difference in theme, plot, and presentation is a stark contrast with Blade Runner 1982. If the original Blade Runner was trying to depict a Japanese corporate takeover in the middle of an international trade war, the plot certainly seems very obscurely written for the purpose. Returning to the movie, remember in his first video TK claims Blade Runner 1982 is, quote, "showing the xenophobic fears of the Japanese takeover of the world," end quote, and, quote, "a takeover of America by Asian culture," end quote. He cites the Tyrell Corporation in the movie as an example, saying, quote, "and then I guess above it all in the original Blade Runner, you have the Tyrell Corporation in this massive pyramid, and I guess I don't actually have to deal with, what Blade Runner's showing us is like a takeover of America by Asian culture," end quote. I don't know how TK looks at an American company building shaped rather vaguely like a massive pyramid and draws the conclusion that, quote, "what Blade Runner's showing is like a takeover of America by Asian culture," end quote. Which Asian culture is known for its pyramids? Japan is certainly not known for pyramids, and in the movie, the Tyrell Corporation, to which this building belongs, is an American company. What is TK basing his conclusion on? He doesn't explain, nor does he cite any sources on which he based this connection. I really don't understand how he gets from American company building shaped like a pyramid to Japanese takeover of the US economy. According to the 1982 official Souvenir magazine, special effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull said, quote, "I can't remember exactly, but I think the pyramid was a composite of my own ideas and director Ridley Scott's," end quote. Meryl Schleyer, Professor Emeritus of Art and Architectural History and Film Studies, has observed that both the Tyrrell Corporation building and Deckard's apartment, quote, "were inspired by pre-Columbian temple architecture," end quote, adding, quote, "Special effects artist Doug Trumbull is crediting with deciding to reference the Mayan pyramids in Mexico," end quote, and further noting, quote, "The Tyrrell's exterior elevators were even appropriated from the central stairs of such temples," end quote. This obviously sounds much more likely than TK's suggestion the building is representing some kind of pyramidal structure originating from what TK describes rather vaguely as Asian culture, whatever he means by that. Schleyer also writes that architect Dietrich Neumann noticed the Tyrrell Corporation looks very like a real building in Los Angeles, the famous 1924 Ennis House, designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright for Charles and Mabel Ennis. On screen now is a photo of the Ennis House from the website of the Los Angeles Conservatory. You should be able to detect notable similarities with the Tyrrell Corporation building, which is unsurprising since the Ennis House likewise drew on Mayan architectural designs. Although I have found many commentators identifying Mayan architectural motifs in the Tyrrell building's design, and some who have compared it to the Ennis House, I have yet to find any who identified the Tyrrell building's stepped pyramid as either specifically Japanese or even more generally Asian. Japan has no real economic presence in Blade Runner 1982. I mentioned previously that in his first video on Cyberpunk, TK claims Blade Runner 1982 represents fears of the US economy being taken over by Japanese corporations. He assures us, quote, "Blade Runner is influenced by these fears of Japan taking over the global economy, which you can see visually in the film," end quote. It's unclear what TK is referring to or where he's getting his information from, since he simply doesn't say. As I've noted previously, he has a habit of making claims about the movie without providing any evidence for them or citing any sources. But he says this can be seen visually in the film, so let's look at the movie ourselves. Surely we'll find the movie dominated by Japanese corporations and conglomerates which are invading America and taking over the economy. We should see them visually in the film. Out of 18 identifiable named companies which appear on screen in some way, according to sources I've found, 12 are real-life American companies. 1. Atari. 2. Bell Telephone. 3. Bulova. 4. Budweiser. 5. Coca-Cola. 6. Cuisinart. 7. Dentine. 8. Jovan. 9. Koss Headphones. 10. Pan Am. 11. Polaroid. 12. RCA Corp. In contrast, of the 6 other companies represented, 1 is a real-life Japanese electronics corporation, TDK, 1 is a real Japanese pharmaceutical company, Wakamoto, 1 is a real-life Chinese beer company, Tsingtao Brewery, that's Qingdao in Chinese, 1 is a fictional French company, Boyard, 1 is a fictional American company, Tyrrell Corporation, and 1 is a fictional Spanish-Japanese company, Dominguez Shimata Corporation. There is also possibly a 7th, a fictional American-Japanese company, Johnson and Murakami, though the reference to this is so brief I'm not sure if it's even actually supposed to be a company or something else. So according to what we actually see in the movie, the American economy is still overwhelmingly dominated by American corporations, and hardly any non-American companies are even visible. The company of the main villain is, of course, American, not Japanese. American corporations are the danger in Blade Runner, not Asian corporations, certainly not Japanese corporations. The most memorably represented product is the cigarette smoked throughout the movie by Detective Dave Holden and the replicant Rachel. The company name on the cigarette box is Boyard, which in real life is actually a French type of cigarette known as a Boyard, such as those sold by the French company Gauloise. Interestingly, in a 22nd of December 1980 version of the Blade Runner script, the movie's tyrannical Tyrrell Corporation, owned by the villain Eldon Tyrrell, was originally called Necco Corporation. That's Neko, Nekko, with a double K in English transliteration, a Japanese noun meaning root, not Neko, Nekko, with a single K, the Japanese noun meaning cat. Neko Corporation would have been a very Japanese name. However, the name was deliberately changed to Terrell Corporation later in the script editing process. This is very clear evidence for an intentional move away from a Japanese corporation to an American one, the very opposite of what TK is claiming. Of course, the ultimate villain of the movie is Eldon Tyrell himself, a very obvious white man with a thoroughly German name. And let's not forget about the other dangerous white German, the replicant Roy Batty. If Blade Runner is supposed to be warning us about foreign takeovers, it seems to be saying a lot more about the dangers of European immigrants to the US than the dangers of Japanese corporations. In fact, when we consider who Blade Runner is really warning us about, we need to realize that the most prolific killer in the entire movie is the protagonist, police detective Rick Deckard, who is entirely willing to carry out the extrajudicial killing of a list of replicants simply because he is told to by his superior officer. Although Deckard only succeeds in killing one of them, with a shot to the back, followed by several more as his victim writhes in agony on the ground, he has obviously killed many more of them in the past. In his personal comments to Deckard, the police officer Gaff says Deckard's captain Harry Bryant believes Deckard is the, quote, smartest spotter, baddest Blade Runner, end quote, indicating he has a well-established reputation for killing replicants. Even more ominously, another of Gaff's comments indicates Deckard has been nicknamed for his brutality, observing, quote, after the slaughter at the steel shop, they called you Mr. Nighttime, end quote. To be clear, this is one Los Angeles police officer telling us another Los Angeles police officer has been given a nickname in recognition of both his willingness to literally slaughter and his competence in doing so. This nickname is also known and spoken by the ramen seller from whom Deckard buys his meal, demonstrating his reputation for brutality is public knowledge at the street level. This may not be a coincidence, given the fact that a 1982 article in the United Press International informs us that the LAPD had developed a reputation for violence over the last couple of years and was facing, quote, recurring charges of brutality and corruption, end quote. The article adds, quote, black groups accused the department of being trigger-happy and of using controversial chokeholds to subdue violent prisoners. They say this caused 17 deaths, although the department says the number is 4 or 5, end quote. It seems nothing much has changed since that time. The theatrical cut of the movie provides Deckard with a voiceover softening this image of brutality somewhat, explaining he had quit being a Blade Runner, quote, because I'd had a belly full of killing, end quote. Nevertheless, this does confirm he has a lengthy history of state-sanctioned homicide, and even the voiceover adds, quote, but then I'd rather be a killer than a victim, end quote, as his justification for returning to this work when contacted by Gaff. Then there's Gaff himself, a police officer who shows great enthusiasm for the extrajudicial killing of the replicants, informing Deckard that he previously told Police Chief Bryant, quote, I could take care of this myself, just move me up, I'll do the job, end quote, adding, quote, 5 phonies, I just air 'em out, pow pow pow, end quote. There is no doubt in Gaff's mind that the replicants are non-human. He calls them phonies and deliberately expresses his willingness to execute them without any moral concerns. The flippancy with which he does so demonstrates he is a police officer comfortable with casual violence towards individuals he is authorized to brutalize. Given the indisputable sympathy Blade Runner shows for the replicants and their simple desire to live for more than the 4 short years they were designed for, do you think perhaps Blade Runner might be telling us something about police brutality and the danger of giving officers license for extrajudicial killing? It's certainly an interpretation deriving naturally from the movie's socio-cultural context, and I'm genuinely surprised TK doesn't seem to have ever considered this. The presence of police violence and brutality against minorities and the socially vulnerable in Blade Runner has been noted and examined by both scholarly and non-academic commentators. I mentioned previously that Blade Runner shows some Japanese companies in the background in an establishing shot. These are visible in Anemoid Row, a small street filled with vendors of replicant animals. See the image on screen now. But Blade Runner itself shows us not all of these vendors are Japanese. In fact, we are shown inside the store belonging to the unnamed Cambodian woman who examines the snake scale Deckard shows her, and the store belonging to snake designer Abdul Ben Hassan, an Arabic name, who advertises himself as the Egyptian. The companies in Anemoid Row are clearly not large Japanese electronics firms. In fact, according to the blog of a Japanese digital editor and Blade Runner fan going by the name Kazuchoice, the names on the Japanese signboards are quite strange. He lists the visible Japanese signboards and translates them into English very literally as cocktail, you are fulfilling on foundation, the mouth of a bird in your hands, the pot, the artificial P-star, the honored tower, and delicious dishes. Some of these sound very obviously like restaurants or diners, especially cocktail, the pot, and delicious dishes, though of course some of these names could have double meanings. In fact, Kazuchoice comments that the Japanese word used for the pot is, quote, like the name of Japanese traditional restaurant, end quote. However, other names he finds quite incomprehensible, suggesting they may even be typographical errors. Nevertheless, this is the greatest density of Japanese company names in the entire movie, and they're not only very obviously tiny stores crammed into a street, some of them are very clearly just small and insignificant eating places. None of them are powerful corporations. If this is supposed to be the Japanese corporate takeover of the US and the world economy, it's clearly not working. Remember, in his first video, TK claims, quote, Blade Runner is influenced by these fears of Japan taking over the global economy, which you can see visually in the film, end quote. In his second video, TK likewise says, quote, you basically have a world that is like taken over by Japan, end quote. Where is the evidence for this? Where can it be seen visually in the film? If the movie is supposed to showcase American fears of Japanese corporate takeover of the American economy, why is the most powerful and dangerous company in the movie, the antagonist which causes the entire plot to come about, an American company with an American CEO villain with a German name? Where are all the dangerous Japanese corporations which have taken over the US economy? Why is there only one major Japanese corporation shown, TDK, which in the early 1980s was mainly known in the US for making audio cassette tapes for recording sound? We don't even have Sony represented in the movie, not even their famous Walkman, despite the fact that this was one of the most recognizable Japanese companies in the entire world at the time, and the Walkman was certainly one of the most recognizable Japanese consumer electronics products in the US. Well, TK thinks he knows. After saying, quote, you basically have a world that is like taken over by Japan, end quote, he follows this up with, quote, in Blade Runner, you have like this massive, I think it's a geisha on these billboards. You see constantly. Seemingly there's a lot of Japanese stuff, but there's also a lot of Chinese stuff because it's also inspired by Kowloon, that old slum in Hong Kong, end quote. Now, for the moment, I'm going to leave aside his claim that Blade Runner is inspired by Kowloon, which is totally untrue. I'll deal with that in the next video. For now, let's look at the scene with the geisha shown on the side of a building, an image which is on screen now. By the way, advertisements with the geisha aren't shown constantly in the movie, they're in a couple of shots. One in an advertisement on a flying blimp, the other in an advertisement on the side of a building. Let's look at the most iconic of these, the one on the side of a building, since it's the one I think he has in mind particularly because it's the one in which Japanese is spoken. According to TK, this advertisement is evidence for a world taken over by Japan. Why? Once again, he doesn't explain, and once again, he doesn't provide a source. It just seems that if there's a Japanese-looking woman in an advertisement speaking in Japanese, that's enough for TK to assume the world has been taken over by Japan. I'm sure he would probably point to the other advertisement with the Japanese woman, but that's hardly an improvement in the volume of evidence for a Japanese economic takeover. I live in Taipei, which is multicultural by Taiwan standards, though hardly at all multicultural by the standards of Melbourne in Australia, where I lived for 7 years. And in Taipei, I regularly encounter advertising in several different languages, including Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, and English, both written and spoken. Occasionally, I also encounter signs in Vietnamese and Thai. Encountering advertising which isn't in your natural language doesn't mean that the world has been taken over by the native speakers of that language. I would be more sympathetic to TK's argument if all the advertising in Blade Runner was in Japanese, or at least the vast majority of it, but it very clearly isn't. As we've already seen, virtually all the company logos are American companies advertising in English. There's also a huge Coca-Cola advertisement on the side of a building, entirely in English. The flying blimp itself is advertising job opportunities in the off-world colonies using both spoken and written English. There's the $1 Million Theatre, a real-life theatre in Los Angeles, shown using Spanish to advertise several real-life Mexican movies and a real-life Peruvian alternative rock band. In fact, if you read the exhaustively excellent blog post article Blade Runner, Typeset in the Future, posted on the 19th of June 2016 by typography specialist Dave Addy, you will see that virtually all readable language in the entire movie, seen on vehicles, newspapers, computer screens, physically printed photographs, building signage, and in various forms of advertising, is in English. Regardless of the various uses of other languages in the movie, which I will cover in another video in this series, the linguistic world of Blade Runner is still overwhelmingly dominated by English. So why is this advertisement with the geisha in both written and spoken Japanese? Well, as I mentioned previously, the Los Angeles of Blade Runner is multicultural, just like the real Los Angeles of 1982, though English is still the dominant language. In fact, we can see that Japanese, though it is used, is very clearly in secondary place. This is demonstrated explicitly by the images we see of the police vehicle Gaff uses to pick up Deckard. The vehicle's exterior has the word police in both English and Japanese, which, for those with a sharp eye, is using kanji characters which are the same Chinese characters used for the word police, but all other text on the body, including a caution warning, the word spinner, which is the vehicle type, and the Department of Motor Vehicle Authorization, is in English. Of course, inside Blade Runner's police vehicle, all the visible language is in English. In Taiwan, I see exactly the same kind of situation, only in my case, the police vehicle signage is almost exclusively in Chinese characters, with English seen only in the single word police and a couple of English letters on the vehicle license plate. As an immigrant to Taiwan, I recognize Blade Runner's world very well. Blade Runner's Los Angeles is a city dominated by the national language of the country, with occasional concessions given to immigrants through the use of a widely used secondary language. This is not remotely a world which has been taken over by Japan. In Taipei, every train on the mass rapid transit system has recorded audio announcements in Mandarin, Taiwanese, Hakka, and English in that order. And it has started including Korean and Japanese on certain stations, which now also have their name written in Chinese characters, Korean Hangul, Japanese kanji and katakana, and English. This is a normal thing which happens in normal places in the real world. TK should recognize this world too, since in the UK, signage and advertising in languages other than English is highly visible in several cities, not just in London. In the railway stations and the underground, at least some signs in various stations can be found in languages such as Bengali, Cantonese, Hindi, Japanese, Mandarin, Nepali, Punjabi, and Urdu. I visited England several times myself over the last 25 years, travelling from Swansea in Wales to the Norfolk Broads in East Anglia, and from Rye in the south to Newcastle on Tyne in the north, along with various trips to Bath, London, Lincolnshire, Manchester, Birmingham, Cambridge, and many other places I can't even recall. During that time, I've seen an abundance of advertising in languages other than English, especially in the last 6 years. In some areas, advertising in a particular language other than English very clearly dominates the local urban landscape. But to interpret this as a sign that the ethnic group to which that language is native has taken over England, or even this part of it, would be outright racist. The fact that TK is so fixated on this point, given he actually lives in England, just baffles me. And I'm highly surprised that he doesn't seem to understand the potentially racial undertones of this kind of thinking. Imagine suggesting this in current-day Los Angeles. Imagine pointing to a video billboard advertising a product in Mandarin and saying, "Oh look, they're taking over the country." And just imagine how that might sound to any Chinese people nearby. So why does TK focus so strongly on this advertisement with the geisha? I don't know, but possibly because Japanese is not only shown in the advertising screen, but also spoken. This suggests the advertising is targeting a Japanese literate audience, but it seems TK thinks it's targeting, much more specifically, an ethnically Japanese audience. But there's no evidence for this, and it seems TK doesn't even contemplate the possibility that non-Japanese people living in Los Angeles might actually be sufficiently literate in Japanese to read advertising in Japanese. Try watching Blade Runner and figuring out how many people shown in the movie are Japanese literate. I can guarantee you won't arrive at an accurate figure because you can't tell what language someone speaks just by looking at them. And if you're thinking, well, it seems to me that there are a lot of Japanese-looking people in Blade Runner, so I guess they all speak Japanese at least, you'd better have a very reliable way of determining who is Japanese just based on their appearance, and if you're going to drill down this far into the Blade Runner world, you might want to consider more complex social issues, such as L1 attrition, the loss of native language competency by immigrants after they've lived in their host country for a certain amount of time, a phenomenon which increases dramatically in the second and third generations. And if you think I'm getting a bit too serious by diving into this level of sociological detail, I'll remind you that all this started when TK decided that Blade Runner showing Japanese advertisements in Los Angeles was corroborating evidence of a world taken over by Japan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and should be met with extraordinary levels of scrutiny. The director Ridley Scott himself commented on the future demographics of Los Angeles when explaining how he depicted the city in Blade Runner, saying, quote, "I think the influence in LA will be very Spanish with a big cross-influence of Oriental," end quote. So even taking into account the awfully homogenizing and insensitive term Oriental, Scott was clearly not concerned by a Japanese takeover. In fact, as we'll see in the next video, in which we'll examine this advertisement in more detail, there's excellent evidence in the movie itself for non-Japanese people in Blade Runner's Los Angeles being able to read and converse in Japanese. It's right there in the movie. There's no need to try and explain the geisha advertising by claiming the US has been taken over by Japan. That makes as much sense as trying to explain mosques in Birmingham by claiming Muslims are taking over the UK. I'll finish this section with a few of TK's more unusual comments, which to me are an illustration of his lack of familiarity with both the movie's own socio-historical context and the movie's content. In his first video, in support of his claim that at the time Blade Runner was released, the US feared economic takeover by Japanese electronics corporations, he says, quote, "So in the late 1970s and 80s is when Japan just dominate consumer electronics, consumer goods, the automobile industry. And you have really cool things like the Sony Walkman," end quote. Firstly, it must be noted that the Japanese didn't dominate the automobile market until some time after Blade Runner had been released. And even the Japanese lead in semiconductor electronics didn't start until about 1983, again after Blade Runner had been released. It wasn't until 1981 that the Japanese semiconductor industry finally gained a technological edge over its US and European rivals, with a New York Times article on the 28th of February 1982 noting Japanese companies had secured 70 to 80% of the market for 64K RAM chips. However, as the article itself notes, the effects of this very specific technological advantage weren't going to be felt for a few years later, and the Blade Runner script had already been written by this point. But even that's only the high-end semiconductor industry. Looking more closely at the consumer electronics industry, which is what TK is most concerned about, we find that in 1980, the US held 32.25% of the world's market share, Japan held 33.7%, and Europe held 34%. So during the year when the earliest form of the Blade Runner script was being written, Japan was absolutely not dominating the consumer electronics market, and was in fact only marginally in second place. Blade Runner's script was absolutely not concerned with a Japan which dominated the consumer electronics market, and neither is the movie. I'll return to TK's comment now, in which we see him use the Sony Walkman as an example of, quote, "Japan just dominate consumer electronics," end quote, citing, quote, "really cool things like the Sony Walkman," end quote. I've placed an image of the 1981 Sony Walkman Model 2 on screen now, for those of you unfamiliar with how they looked at the time. It really was a work of art and looked incredibly futuristic. I couldn't even own one until the 90s, by which time they were still a status symbol. The Walkman is so iconic and so strongly associated with Japan's emerging success in the 1980s consumer electronics market that it's natural for TK to cite it. However, the irony is that although it was highly popular virtually as soon as it was released, it took some time to capture market share from the previously established portable stereos known as boomboxes. And when I say portable, I know from personal experience at the time that they were only just portable. They weren't remotely pocket-sized like the Walkman. You literally carried them with a large handle or balanced them on one shoulder. An article in the New York Times on the 5th of June 1981 observes, quote, "The portable stereo craze actually started 3 or 4 years ago with the so-called boom boxes, those blaring behemoths that can weigh up to 30 pounds and announce their presence a block away," end quote, before adding, quote, "Those units, which cost $100 to more than $600, still far outsell the new mini stereo systems like the Walkman," end quote. So ironically, the Walkman is not a good example for TK's argument for a Japanese consumer electronics takeover of the US. In fact, it never even appears in Blade Runner, and nor does its manufacturer, Sony. Particularly relevant to the socio-historical context of Blade Runner is the fact that by the time the movie script was being written, sales of Japanese electronic consumer products to the US were actually falling. A New York Times article published on the 8th of May 1983 observed that this year the Japanese electronics industry was making a greater effort to attract consumers, quote, "after 2 years of declines," end quote. The article explained, quote, "The sluggish world economy and the near saturation ownership of such items as televisions, table model video cassette recorders, and audio products caused a setback for Japan's consumer product manufacturers, which make color televisions, clock radios, and car stereos, as well as components and portable cassette players," end quote. So, at the very time that the Blade Runner script was being written, and the movie itself was being produced and released, Japanese electronic consumer product market share in the US was falling, not rising. This is completely counterintuitive to the claim that Blade Runner was motivated by fears of Japanese electronic consumer product dominance. The last comment of TK's I want to address in this section is his claim, quote, "Of course, Japan at this time is really the only place making good video games, as opposed to America and all the stuff with E.T., end quote. Since I lived through the period in question, I found this statement particularly odd. I remember very well exactly which video game manufacturers were the most popular. In particular, everyone wanted the Atari 2600, an early American game console which held 44% of the market share in 1980 and 58% in 1982. It was literally the industry leader in the US and elsewhere. I didn't have the 2600 myself, but I was fortunate enough to own the modest Commodore VIC-20, a fully fledged home computer and ideal for learning touch typing and proper programming in languages such as BASIC, binary, hexadecimal, and machine code. Of course, it could still play games, though they were pretty terrible, and you could even write them yourself, and those ones were even more terrible. From 1980 until 1983, when the great video game industry crash occurred, Atari was the biggest name in home video game entertainment. Consequently, it's no surprise that Atari is one of the US corporations clearly visible in Blade Runner 1982, with the logo appearing prominently as seen on screen now. Where did TK get the idea that Japan at this time is really the only place making good video games? I don't know, because he doesn't explain this or cite any sources for it. The best I can suggest is that it's a humorous throwaway comment alluding to the disastrous release of the Atari video game E.T., based on the movie of the same name, but even that was released in mid-1982, a month after the Blade Runner movie. So even taking E.T. into account, Japan was not the only place making good video games at the time of Blade Runner. Audience reception of Blade Runner 1982. As we've seen, TK has assured us repeatedly that Blade Runner 1982 was written as an expression of American fears of Japanese corporate takeover in response to Japanese electronics corporations flooding the American market with cheaper but superior electronics consumer products. He never provided any actual evidence for this, and we've seen the historical facts are completely different to what he claimed, but there's something we haven't examined yet. What did Blade Runner's original audience understand the movie to mean? If TK is correct, Blade Runner's audience would have left theatres satisfied that they'd seen a timely cyberpunk movie which addressed their personal concerns over international trade relations with Japan, their fears that the American economy would soon be totally taken over by Japanese corporations, and their terror of the sudden availability of cheap but high-quality electronic consumer products. However, this is not what happened at all. In her 2010 book Yellow Future, Oriental Style in Hollywood, Senior Lecturer of Gender and Cultural Studies Dr. Jane Ji-Yoon Park explains, quote, "When it opened at theatres on June 25, 1982, however, Blade Runner met with dismal returns at the box office and mixed responses from the critics. A few months before its release, producers had screened a rough cut, later known as the director's cut, for focus groups in Dallas and Denver. Frightened by the negative audience response, executives ordered a recut to make the film more intelligible to the American public," end quote. The movie's opening was a disaster because the audience could not relate to it at all and did not understand what it was trying to say. Sean Redmond, Associate Professor of Media and Communication, likewise said Blade Runner experienced, quote, "poor test screenings where people complained about a confusing plot and a dour ending," end quote, compelling the director to release a different version with a laboriously explanatory voiceover from Deckard. Far from seeing Blade Runner as an insightful commentary on an impending trade war reflecting public fear about imported Japanese consumer electronics, the audience just found it confusing. Deckard's voiceover, of course, didn't say anything to indicate the real point of the movie was a Japanese economic takeover or the dangers of cheap and high-quality consumer electronics. The reception from professional movie critics was just as bad. Most reviewers regarded the movie as indulging more in style than substance, regarding it as a pretentious display draped over an empty plot. A reviewer in the New Yorker on the 12th of July 1982 wrote, quote, "If anybody comes around with a test to detect humanoids, maybe Ridley Scott and his associates should hide. With all the smoke in this movie, you feel as if everyone connected with it needs to have his flue cleaned," end quote. On the 25th of June 1982, famous movie critic Roger Ebert similarly wrote that the movie's main weakness, quote, "is that it allows the special effects technology to overwhelm its story," end quote, concluding dismissively, quote, "The obligatory love affair is pro forma, the villains are standard issue, and the climax is yet one more of those cliffhangers, with Ford dangling over an abyss by his fingertips," end quote. He did make an interesting additional comment saying, quote, "The movie takes place in a Los Angeles that looks like a futuristic Tokyo, with gigantic billboards showing smiling Japanese girls drinking Coca-Cola," end quote, adding, quote, "I would have predicted LA would be Hispanic, but never mind," end quote. But ironically, even this mixes up some of the movie's scenes. Likewise, on the 25th of June 1982, a reviewer in the Los Angeles Times wrote, quote, "If the story is frail and unhelpful, to put it politely, it is certainly drenched in atmosphere," end quote, adding, quote, "that this much craft and dedication is at the service of such a wafer-thin story is sad," end quote. On the 28th of June 1982, New York Magazine journalist David Denby made the same kind of comment, though with an important addition, writing, quote, "Don't filmmakers ever get tired of living off the film noir detective genre of the 40s? The futuristic Blade Runner is still another imitation homage parody of a Humphrey Bogart movie. Set in the Los Angeles of 2019, Blade Runner is all visuals and no story," end quote. Note that this time, not only is the movie criticized for being all visuals and no story, it is also criticized for being a poor quality parody of much better 1940s film noir movies. Although it is characterized as futuristic, it certainly isn't identified as cyberpunk. In fact, you may have realized that none of the reviews we've read identified Blade Runner 1982 as cyberpunk, a significant point to which we'll return in a later video in this series. Denby's criticism dismissed Blade Runner's dialogue as pretentious and scorned its attempt at futurism, writing, quote, "The movie is full of gadgets, space cars and video scanners and the like, so kids might find it amusing, like some overcomplicated new toy, but it's still a terribly dull movie," end quote. Again, note the consistent absence of any identification of the movie as cyberpunk, and note again the complete absence of any connection to a US-Japan trade war or Japanese corporate takeover of the US economy, even when electronics are mentioned. In case you're wondering, yes, the term cyberpunk did already exist at this time. It was coined in 1980. And again, that's a point to which we'll return in a later video. Unlike these popular level reviews, Blade Runner was much better understood by the more detailed scholarly articles analysing its message. The 3-page article Blade Runner by Kellner, Leibovitz and Ryan, published in the formally refereed journal Jump Cut, a review of contemporary media, though short, contained a number of very important insights, indicating Blade Runner's core message was visible to those who viewed it at a greater level of depth than the average casual audience member or pop media reviewer. This article placed Blade Runner in a category of films which, quote, "focus on the dangers of increased pollution, nuclear war, and economic exploitation," end quote, adding, quote, "some contain veiled allegorical critiques of advanced capitalism, for example, Alien, Outland, Blade Runner," end quote. Notice the themes identified as central to Blade Runner's message have nothing to do with xenophobic fears of Japan, certainly not trade wars over cars and electronics. Instead, the article said movies such as Blade Runner, quote, "make a critical commentary on current forms of life and social organization with images of what intensified corporate capitalism, political repression, and contemporary forms of dehumanization might produce in the future," end quote. These are all themes which are transparently visible in Blade Runner. The very concept of the replicants is a literal embodiment of dehumanization. The article focused particularly on Blade Runner's powerful critique of capitalism, saying it, quote, "presents a more critical dystopia in that it projects a future city which perpetuates corporate capitalism's distinguishing features: urban decay, commodification, overcrowding, highly skewed disparities of wealth and poverty, and authoritarian policing," end quote. Notice again how these themes were sufficiently explicit in Blade Runner to be identified by those watching closely, and notice also how those themes reflected active social concerns of the average person in the early 1980s, particularly authoritarian policing, which was very much a concern in early 1980s Los Angeles. The article went on to note, quote, "the film's urban images present a world where advanced capitalism's worst features have coalesced to produce a polluted, overpopulated city in a society controlled by giant corporations." Yet again, Blade Runner is identified as a fundamentally anti-capitalist movie with a strong anti-corporate and pro-ecological message. Although the article did note the presence of non-American companies in Blade Runner, it did not attribute them to any kind of Japanese economic takeover or dominance of the world economy. On the contrary, it noted very accurately, quote, "the mixture of signs from Japanese, European, and US capitalism points to a future society where trilateral capitalism has achieved its dream of a world economic system," end quote. Note in particular the term trilateral capitalism, making the point that the capitalism of this future dystopia is shared between 3 large economic powers: Europe, the US, and Japan, with none of them having established global dominance. This, the article says, is a world economic system. The article then addresses Blade Runner's presentation of Asian people in its fictional Los Angeles, raising the possibility of the movie having been influenced by, quote, "common fears about overpopulation and foreigners overrunning future cities," end quote, explaining that on the US East and West Coasts, quote, "Japanese ramen and sushi cafes have replaced US fast food chains, and visibly prominent are many Asian merchants and street people," end quote. Very pertinently, the article then says, quote, "the film here seems to articulate paranoia about Japanese capitalism taking over the United States, end quote. This is as close as the article comes to supporting TK's argument that Blade Runner was motivated by fears of Japanese economic takeover. However, the article then takes a sharp turn away from this suggestion, arguing, quote, nevertheless, the film's city, Los Angeles, seems under the hegemony of US capitalism, which now seems to have incorporated its rivals into its structure, end quote. This is exactly what I observed previously. Blade Runner's dystopian world is dominated by American corporations and products, with Japanese corporations and companies being virtually non-existent, and the majority of visible Japanese businesses being tiny street-level stores. There is no hint of any significant Japanese economic presence. The article itself makes a very similar point, observing, quote, most of the merchants in the film are Asian or European, whereas the corporate president and executives of the Tyrell Corporation are all North Americans, end quote. Notice in particular how the article describes the street-level merchants as Asian or European, while the corporate-level executives, quote, are all North Americans, end quote. There is no trade war with Japan here. There is no Japanese corporate takeover. There is no invasion of Japanese car manufacturers and cheap consumer electronics. There is no Japanese domination of the US and world economy. If Blade Runner is addressing these elite concerns at all, it is dismissing them as irrelevant and denying they will come true. The article also comments on the many corporate buildings visible in Blade Runner, saying, quote, these towers contain corporate headquarters and look like Mayan temples, end quote. Notice these buildings are not interpreted as Japanese, contrary to the way TK understood them. The article's authors rightly focus on Blade Runner's anti-capitalist message, observing the movie expresses, quote, fears of capitalist exploitation, technological dehumanization, and the collapse of values such as love, empathy, and community, end quote. The authors understand the replicants to, quote, stand for capitalism's oppressive features and, to a lesser degree, rebellion against exploitation, end quote, adding, quote, similarly, capitalism today makes individuals into machines disciplined to fit into the labor system, end quote. Note the replicants are not interpreted racially, whereas much later commentators on the movie would read them as coded either black or Asian, despite the fact that the movie itself explicitly represents all of the replicants as white. Early scholarly commentary on Blade Runner 1982 continued to assess accurately the movie's original intent, and where it did take account of the movie's Asian representation, it drew very different conclusions to TK. In his 1985 article, The Triumph of Asian Americans, published by The New Republic, American historian David A. Bell described a Blade Runner scene, citing, quote, a model in a kimono hawking products in Japanese, end quote, quote, figures clad in traditional East Asian peasant garb, end quote, and, quote, an English made unrecognizable by the additions of hundreds of Spanish and Asian words, end quote. Bell then revealed, quote, this is, of course, a scene from a science fiction movie, Ridley Scott's 1982 Blade Runner. It is also a vision that Asian Americans dislike intensely, end quote. We might think that Bell would then explain that the reason Asian Americans dislike this scene is that they think it's racist, or that they feel it's Orientalism, or that they feel they're being homogenized, or that they think it's expressing traditional yellow peril fears of the US being taken over by Asian immigrants. However, we would be wrong. Bell then recounted the history of anti-Asian racism in the US, writing, quote, hysterical warnings of an imminent Asian takeover of the United States stained a whole century, end quote, adding that this fear resulted in, quote, racial violence, legal segregation, and the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans in concentration camps, end quote. Then Bell came to the real reason why Asian Americans might feel uncomfortable with their very obvious representation in Blade Runner, writing, quote, today, integration into American society, not transformation of American society, is the goal of an overwhelming majority, end quote. In other words, Asian Americans don't want to stand out, they want to fit in. They don't want to be so readily identified as immigrants. They want to be seen as regular members of society. Given the way Blade Runner depicts them so visibly and distinctly, Bell asked, quote, "So why did the critics praise Blade Runner for its realism? The answer is easy to see. The Asian American population is exploding," end quote. In case we're still in any doubt as to the real import of Bell's article, his later words make it clear that Asian Americans had become extremely successful in the US and had done so without significant conflict, saying, quote, "But even more astonishing is the extent to which Asian Americans have become prominent out of all proportion to their share of the population," end quote. Adding, quote, "Most remarkable of all, it is taking place with relatively little trouble," end quote. It is perhaps even more remarkable that this review of Blade Runner, written around the height of the 1980s US trade war with Japan and the rise of Japanese economic strength, does not interpret the movie as either xenophobic or concerned with Japanese economic influence on the US or the world. 2 years later, a brief mention in the journal Science Fiction Studies demonstrates Blade Runner's reputation had not improved, with the author writing, quote, "We get sci-fi films with clutter and texture, like Blade Runner and Dune, and excess scenography substitutes quantity for depth and accumulation for movement," end quote. Again, note the repeated claim that Blade Runner was more style than substance, and a dismissal of its plot, which wasn't seen as remotely significant to current events, despite the fact that by this stage, the US-Japan trade war had already reached its peak. Instead, this author observes that Blade Runner's aesthetic had been interpreted as illustrative of, quote, "the triumph of late capitalist consumer culture," end quote. In a 1988 article written for the alternative art magazine Fuse, anarchist activist Dot Tour compared Blade Runner's vision of the future to the present day of 1988, writing, quote, "Contrary to mass media representation, anarchism is not just libertarianism or bomb-throwing men waving black flags, but a serious philosophy coming to grips with a world where Blade Runner is beginning to look like a fairy tale in comparison to the threats of capitalist greed breeding genetic mutation, apartheid, genocide, counterinsurgency slaughter, nuclear annihilation, and environmental extinction," end quote. However, as late as 1990, Blade Runner was still being shunned by many film critics who saw nothing deep, meaningful, or socially relevant in its plot. A one-line review in the New York Magazine on the 12th of February 1990 read simply, quote, "an unsuccessful homage parody of 40s film noir set in 21st century Los Angeles," end quote. In the same year, filmmaker and critic Richard Myers echoed earlier criticisms of Blade Runner as an exercise in style over substance, commenting dismissively, quote, "Blade Runner was a collection of film sets in search of a movie," end quote. This final comment appears to have been the typical position held by pop media commentators on Blade Runner right up to the start of the 1990s. In fact, I couldn't find any interpretation of Blade Runner connecting it to fears of Japanese takeover until the development of the literary critical concept called techno-orientalism, which seems to have emerged after the 1990s, long after the movie was released. Techno-orientalism was consequently retrojected onto Blade Runner as an explanation of the movie's motivations. But this anachronistic interpretation reflects the interests and concerns of people in the 1990s, not those of 10 years prior. It's entirely possible this interpretation of Blade Runner may predate 1990, and I just haven't found evidence for it, but I am confident saying this interpretation doesn't seem to have occurred to anyone at the time the movie was first released, or from 1982 to 1990. The fact is that since Blade Runner's plot was based on the 1968 proto-cyberpunk story Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, it had its origin in popular science fiction, and consequently reflected the concerns of the average person on the street, not the concerns of the elite. The themes in Philip K. Dick's original story, which carried over to Blade Runner, were those of working-class economic insecurity, the dissolution of the social fabric, the apocalyptic shadow of environmental destruction and nuclear war, the brevity and cheapness of human life under capitalism, and the individual's inevitable subordination to the all-powerful corporation. There is clear evidence for this in the movie's socio-historical context and in its public reception. Dick himself commented very enthusiastically on how Blade Runner had captured the intent of his original novel, saying in an interview, quote, "They caught it perfectly. After I finished reading the screenplay, I got the novel out and looked through it. The two reinforce each other so that someone who started with the novel would enjoy the movie, and someone who started with the movie would enjoy the novel." End quote. The average person on the street in 1982 wasn't concerned with the potential international trade war with Japan over cars, or alarmed by Japan producing the most 64K RAM chips, or horrified by the prospect of purchasing cheap, high-quality Japanese TVs and Walkmans. In fact, in 1981, the Walkman and its many copies from other companies in Hong Kong and Japan itself were selling so well in the US that demand exceeded supply. An article in the New York Times on the 5th of June 1981 stated, quote, "The player receivers have been in such short supply that prices have generally remained firm," end quote, quoting one US retailer declaring, quote, "We can't bring enough in," end quote. Meanwhile, the article notes, portable stereo boomboxes were still massively outselling Walkmans, with a rough estimate of 7.8 million boomboxes sold in 1980, in contrast to around 800,000 Walkmans. This certainly doesn't look like the average person on the street was concerned by a trade war with Japan over cars, or Japanese consumer products flooding the US market, or a Japanese corporate takeover of the US economy or world economy. Actual social concerns in Blade Runner 1982's era. As we have seen, misinterpretations of Blade Runner 1982 are typically the product of commentators failing to understand the social concerns of the people who lived around the time the movie was made, and instead projecting the concerns of a later era or even their own personal concerns. From 1977 to 1982, while the screenplay was being written and the movie was being produced, the average American on the street was concerned about the threat of environmental collapse, impending nuclear war, the crack cocaine addiction outbreak in 1980, the AIDS epidemic, which became public in 1981, the US economic recession of 1981 to 1982, and the widespread deindustrialization it caused. People were concerned about the rise of corporate raider culture in the late 1970s and early 80s, which placed tens of thousands of workers under the merciless control of cruel and faceless corporations. They were concerned about the earnings inequality, which had risen sharply since 1977, especially between men, and they became increasingly concerned about Reagan's public welfare cuts. They were concerned about the mass unemployment caused by US companies firing American citizens and outsourcing their jobs to other countries, which was the complete opposite of a Japanese takeover of the economy. And they were concerned about the stress all this placed on the nation's social integrity, which had already been strained considerably by the fallout from the social conflicts of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. I've mentioned previously TK's failure to differentiate between elite social concerns and the social concerns of the non-elite. TK looked at Ronald Reagan's concerns about Japanese car companies and the fears of some US corporate executives that they might lose car sales in their local market due to cheaper Japanese imports, but these are elite concerns, and Blade Runner is a pop culture product reflecting the concerns of non-elites. Now, it's true that sometimes elite and non-elite concerns aligned, especially racially, and sometimes they aligned economically, but even then they often had a different focus. In February 1981, 1,500 construction workers protested at a building site for which a Japanese company was the prime contractor. However, although the New York Times tells us the workers were, quote, shouting hostile words and even racial epithets, end quote, it also says they were, quote, angry because the prime contractor is a non-union company, end quote. despite being expressed with racist language, the real objection was to the company's lack of unionization and perceptions of Japanese companies as uncaring of workers, since they were typically not unionized. The workers, though racist, were not motivated by xenophobic fears of Japan taking over the country or stealing their jobs. In the same year, workers for Ford Motors belonging to the United American Workers Union demonstrated publicly by sledgehammering a Japanese-built 1975 Toyota Corolla to destruction, accompanied by a sign saying, quote, "If you sell in America, build in America," end quote. At first glance, this looks like just a racist attack on a Japanese company fueled by xenophobia. But again, note the actual reason for this protest. These workers did not object to Japanese companies competing with American companies. They didn't even object to Japanese companies selling their cars in America. What they actually wanted was Japanese car companies to start investing in the US economy by building manufacturing plants in America itself, hiring American workers to build cars, and then selling those cars in America. This is the complete opposite of how TK imagines the social background to Blade Runner. Whereas TK claims Americans were afraid of Japanese companies taking over the US economy, and indeed the world economy, these American workers actually welcomed Japanese companies entering the US economy. They just wanted to be hired on good terms and keep their union rights. We'll see this in more detail when we examine what was happening in 1981, while the final Blade Runner screenplay was being written. In fact, when we look at the concerns of the non-elite workers, we find that as far back as 1979, there were American workers who were entirely comfortable with Japanese automobile and motorcycle companies building manufacturing plants in the US and offering jobs. In a 3rd of June 1979 article in the New York Times, one such worker is interviewed. The article reads, quote, "I never think of it as a Japanese company since there aren't any Japanese here," said Brad Carper, age 25, a welder with a blonde ponytail who is wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with the slogan, "If I didn't like it here, I wouldn't be here." The Kawasaki factory here, a corporate hybrid representing a deft blending of East and West business practices, is symbolic of Japanese economic success in this country, end quote. This is much more indicative of the non-elite attitudes reflected in Blade Runner than the concerns of the automobile executive elites. There's no xenophobia here, and certainly no fear of Japanese economic takeover. This is quite a different historical narrative to the one TK supplied. A year later, a 31st of May 1980 Washington Post article states explicitly that it was the, quote, auto and some other unions, end quote, which were, quote, pressing foreign companies to locate plants in the United States, end quote, adding, quote, the federal aid programs would help in this, so the unions might not object much either, end quote. Notice how the unions express the concerns of the non-elites, the workers who actually want foreign car companies to build manufacturing facilities in the US, which would provide them with jobs. The article acknowledged this was still a sensitive subject, citing the head of the US Chamber of Commerce saying that such investment was, quote, to a lot of people, repugnant and an emotional question, end quote. However, the article goes on to say that members of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Chamber of Commerce, quote, said it will help create new jobs and revive poor and decaying communities, end quote. As we've seen, TK cited a libertarian think tank article which mentioned Ronald Reagan's 1981 speech expressing his concern over Japanese car imports. This could easily give the misleading impression that the average American held the same concerns as Reagan, and that the president's view was a reflection of social attitudes at street level. However, what the libertarian article doesn't mention, and which TK may be unaware of, is the attitude of President Jimmy Carter's 11th of October speech in 1980, in which he announced plans to actively encourage Japanese companies to invest in the US economy. In this speech, Carter says, quote, "I've expressed concern to the Japanese about the level of Japanese imports, and I have stated quite clearly that the United States does not intend to abandon any portion of our share of the domestic auto market. I have also encouraged Japanese car companies to increase their investments in the United States and urged Japan to reduce the barriers to the sale of US cars and parts in Japan." End quote. Notice how Carter explicitly urges, quote, "Japanese car companies to increase their investments in the United States," end quote, which, as we have seen, is exactly what the non-elite US automobile unions and their workers wanted. In this case, political elite and working class non-elite interests aligned with the same aim, to increase employment for the working class. Remember, this speech was given just 2 months before the second major draft of the Blade Runner screenplay was completed on the 15th of December 1980. Let's look more at the non-elite response to Japanese companies investing in the US economy in the early 1980s. A 20th of April 1981 article in the New York Times reports on a car manufacturing plant being built in the city of Smyrna in the state of Georgia, which has traditionally not been the most progressive thinking area of America. However, the article tells us enthusiastically, quote, "About 2,200 American workers will be employed here. The plant, eagerly sought by the state and generously subsidized by the city, county, and state, is expected to provide $77 million a year to the Smyrna area in increased personal income and $60 million in increased retail sales," end quote. Note this investment by the Japanese car company Nissan was, quote, "eagerly sought by the state and generously subsidized by the city, county, and state," end quote. This certainly doesn't look like xenophobic fear of a Japanese takeover. But what did the non-elites at the grassroots level think? The article states explicitly, quote, "The town of Smyrna clearly welcomes this invasion," end quote, quoting a local real estate agent saying, quote, "The plant is the best thing since 7-Up," end quote. Similarly, the article reports the editor of the local newspaper, quote, "said of the Japanese, 'These people think. They have a different lifestyle. These people will wind up causing us to think more about the wrong things we do, help us to do things right, and to feel proud about ourselves," end quote. A third local voice is also cited, quote, "D. Delight, a clerk at the Smyrna feed mill, said, 'It's great. It will bring jobs. A lot of people need jobs,' end quote." Again, where's the xenophobic fear of Japanese takeover? Certainly not here. And again, note the strong difference between elite and non-elite concerns. Repeatedly, we find local non-elites, such as unions and their workers, welcoming Japanese companies building manufacturing facilities in their own towns precisely because it would provide employment. A New York Times article on the 11th of February 1982 demonstrates how successful Japanese investment could be, noting that in 1975, quote, "Sanyo of Japan took over a unionized and failing American electronics firm," end quote, with a workforce which had fallen from 1,200 to a mere 200. The article states that the employees were represented by the International Union of Electrical Workers and that, quote, "the first thing Sanyo did was to assign Japanese managers who quickly called the union committee in for a meeting," end quote. The results of Sanyo cooperating with the union were dramatic. The article informs us, quote, "Today, employment at the plant has risen to more than 2,000, end quote. Again, ask yourself who was really concerned about Japanese car imports and a Japanese economic takeover. Do you really think it was the non-elites, the American workers, whose unions encouraged Japanese companies to build manufacturing plants in their towns, providing employment opportunities and restoring the economic fortunes of previously failing companies? Now let's return to that issue of Japanese car imports and look at who was most concerned about Japanese car manufacturers investing in the US labor market and why. An 8th of January 1982 article in the New York Times reports on conflict between the United Automobile Workers Trade Union and, quote, "top executives of the two largest American automobile companies," end quote. The article says the executives argued, quote, "high labor costs are pushing the price of cars made in this country too high to compete with those imported from Japan," end quote, and were attempting to get unions to convince American workers to accept lower pay. Look at the conflict here between elite and non-elite interests. It's the socially elite executives who are concerned about Japanese car imports, not the non-elite workers. Predictably, the article tells us the car manufacturing executives warned the trade union that if they did not accept a lower pay for their workers, quote, production will be increasingly shifted out of the country to areas with lower wages, end quote. It's very clear that fears over Japanese car imports were elite concerns. It wasn't the workers going to the governments begging for high tariffs and trade sanctions against Japan, it was their corporate overlords. In fact, the same newspaper article made it entirely clear that the workers themselves were far more willing to cooperate with and even work for those Japanese companies which had started entering the US, noting that Ford Motor Company was selling 75% of one of its steel mills to Japanese company Nippon Kokan. Although the article noted, quote, some of the employees at the steel plant are not happy at the prospect of working for Japanese managers, end quote, it went on to quote one of the presidents of the United Automobile Workers saying, quote, many of our members don't go along with the idea of working for the Japanese, but if they come in with the right attitude, I'd be prepared to go along. It's 4,500 jobs, end quote. Note that last comment indicating how highly the union leader valued the prospect of a Japanese company providing 4,500 jobs for US workers. That's a typical non-elite concern, availability of employment for the working class. Now, it's true, we're also told, quote, many of our members don't go along with the idea of working for the Japanese, end quote, and that could very well be for outright racist reasons, but where's all the fear of a trade war with Japan, and Japan supposedly taking over the world economy? It's not even mentioned. Where's all the fear of Japanese corporations taking over the US economy? It's not even mentioned. This is completely contradictory to TK's repeated claims that these were popular concerns in the US at the time Blade Runner 1982 was written and produced. So on the one hand, we have socio-economic elites such as the US car manufacturing executives fearing loss of income from Japanese car imports and responding by threatening their workers with the prospect of firing them and giving their jobs to cheaper overseas labourers. And on the other hand, we have the non-elite workers who, although they had both compatibility concerns and even racist concerns about working for a Japanese company, saw no personal threat from Japanese car imports. And we can see that some of them were even prepared to welcome Japanese car companies opening production in the US, since it would lead to more employment opportunities for US workers. We can also see that in the case of Sanyo, an almost dead American company of 200 workers was revived by Sanyo in just 6 years, becoming a company of 2,000 workers. While the US executives were offering American workers the prospect of reduced pay or being fired, the Japanese companies were offering American workers the prospect of more jobs. Who do you think felt more threatened by Japanese car imports? Of course, it was the elite executives, not the non-elite workers. This is not difficult to figure out, and we've seen plenty of evidence for this. This is why socio-historical analysis of literature and other media must be carried out with care at both the elite and non-elite level, using a historiographical method called social history, which emerged in the academy during the 1960s. A good social history of the United States is historian Howard Zinn's important work, A People's History of the United States, originally published in 1980 and currently available in a revised and updated third edition, first published in 2003. I own the 2013 printing. It takes a strongly critical perspective with a very good focus on US imperialism throughout the 20th century, especially during the Cold War. To close this section, I'll acknowledge freely that it is entirely possible that during the time when Blade Runner was being written and developed, there was some economic fear of Japan at the public level, some fear of the Japanese car industry invading America, some fear of Japanese corporations taking over the American economy, some fear of cheap Japanese electronics flooding the American market, and I just haven't been looking in the right places to find sufficient historical evidence for any of this. That is entirely possible. But at present, I'm confident saying that at the very least, these don't seem to have been dominant concerns or even primary concerns at the non-elite level, and I don't see any evidence they were a significant influence on the screenplay and production of Blade Runner. Blade Runner 1982's intended message. The reason why Blade Runner failed so dismally at the box office is that although it attempted to address some of the social concerns I've described, it largely did so in such an indirect manner that it didn't communicate well to its popular audience. This was due to the fact that the screenplay went through so many edits at the hands of various writers that the movie ended up looking more like a sci-fi film noir detective story, with the most prominent theme being what it means to be human, a complex philosophical message which did not combine effectively with the more simplistic detective-style narrative, and which overshadowed the movie's efforts to address the real social concerns of the late 1970s and early 80s, which were so visible in the original script. Contrary to what on-screen credits often imply, a movie screenplay is rarely written by one person in a single draft, or even by one person in multiple drafts. Often it passes through several drafts, sometimes at the hands of various different writers or editors, and along the way, the narrative can change quite dramatically in theme, tone, and plot. Occasionally, the director and producers may take what the writers and editors have produced and turn it into something else entirely. Sometimes this results in a better product, and sometimes it results in a disaster. Very often, it results in a final script which conveys very little of the originally intended message, or at least obscures it significantly. Blade Runner's script suffered this fate. The Blade Runner screenplay started in 1978 as a movie narrativization of Dick's original novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This initial narrativization was written by Hampton Fancher. It even bore the name of the original novel. Throughout 1979, the script was revised repeatedly by Fancher, who moved the plot location from San Francisco to Los Angeles and made numerous other changes. The working title was changed to just Android, changed again to Mechanismo, and later changed yet again to Dangerous Days. The narrative also changed considerably as the character of Deckard was developed, and various concepts were added or removed, though concerns with ecological damage and environmental collapse remained central. At this point, the movie still lacked a director, but Ridley Scott joined the project in early 1980 and began working with Fancher on script rewrites. The first fully complete script, which was now called Blade Runner, was completed by Fancher on the 24th of July 1980. However, unbeknown to Fancher, Ridley Scott then gave the script to David Peoples for a rewrite, only to be told by Peoples that Fancher's work was so good, quote, "There's nothing I can do to make this script any better," end quote. However, at Scott's request, Peoples agreed to be hired to make changes directed by Ridley. Peoples' first draft was delivered by the 15th of December 1980. By this time, the narrative had departed far from Fancher's original vision, but it would undergo one more transformation before production. Without telling either Fancher or Peoples, Scott next had additional editing work made on Peoples' 15th of December 1980 script, with the result that a new script had appeared by the 22nd of December 1980 without any further contribution from Peoples or Fancher. According to Peoples, quote, "They'd done that by pasting in scenes from Hampton's earlier drafts with some of the stuff I'd done on the 15th, end quote. This final version of the script was completed in February 1981. Although this screenplay remained true to the spirit and central themes of Dick's original novel, it did not make them as explicit as Fancher's first script had. In his book Future Noir, The Making of Blade Runner, originally published in 1996 and updated and revised several times since, filmmaker Paul Salmon writes, quote, "Of all the various elements which would subsequently be altered or dropped from Fancher's first draft, however, the one he still feels most strongly about can be summarized in one word: ecology," end quote. He also quotes Fancher saying, quote, "At the time I wrote my first Sheep screenplay, I'd become increasingly alarmed about environmental matters. Every day I was thinking, where are the owls? Where are the trees? Where is our fresh water? So those ecological concerns became critical to the first draft and, in fact, crucial to that draft's original ending," end quote. Note, of course, the lack of any reference to trade wars with Japan or xenophobic fears of a Japanese takeover of the US. These concepts never appeared in any of the Blade Runner script drafts. Social fears of environmental collapse were still represented by Blade Runner in the various references to the extinction of biological animals and their replacement by replicant counterparts. However, they were not made particularly explicit, and they were often missed by early audiences, despite the very obvious presence of replicant animals. In the theatrical cut of the movie shown on release in 1982, the replicant Rachel has this exchange with Detective Deckard. Quote, Rachel, do you like our owl? Deckard, it's artificial? Rachel, of course it is. Deckard, must be expensive. End quote. This exchange indicates that people in Blade Runner's world should expect a pet animal will be artificial rather than real, but doesn't really indicate why anyone would buy an expensive replicant rather than a biological owl. This is very different to the way this exchange was worded in the much earlier 24th of July 1980 script, in which Deckard asked, "It's artificial?" implying the rarity of biological animals in the Blade Runner world, to which Rachel replied, "Of course not," indicating a corporate executive would reasonably expect to own a real owl. Thus, in the theatrical cut, the ecological message was made less explicit. The environmental concerns of the 70s and early 80s were also represented in the acid rain which falls constantly on Los Angeles in Blade Runner. But like the animal extinction, this is not made clear. Blade Runner's rain-drenched exterior scenes are well known, but there are no direct indicators that this rain is a poisonous industrial byproduct. TV producer and media commentator William Fisher's 11-page article of Living Machines and Living Machines, Blade Runner and the Terminal Genre, published in 1988 in the New Literary History Journal, is the earliest academic literary analysis I have found to address in depth the key themes and concepts Blade Runner inherited from both Dick's novel and the social criticisms introduced by Fancher's first scripts. Fisher is well aware of the movie's environmental message, observing, for example, quote, the acid rain that unabatingly pelts the city, end quote. Fisher also points out Blade Runner's visual representation of the world's economically stratified society, appropriately symbolized in the movie as a housing complex in the shape of a pyramid, explaining, quote, on its cue, daily life takes on a remarkably concrete character. Low lives are those who cannot afford to live on the 100th floor in a 300-story apartment complex. The corporate hierarchy is housed in a pyramid, end quote. The dehumanizing exploitation which American workers were suffering at the hands of corporations was also represented by Blade Runner in the replicants created by Tyrell Corporation. The callous corporate mass dismissal of unwanted American workers was represented by Blade Runner in the hunting and termination of replicants, now, very literally, at end of life. The connection of this termination to real-life workers no longer useful to their companies is represented very well in the on-screen text in the opening of the 1982 theatrical cut of Blade Runner, which says that killing a replicant, quote, was not called execution, it was called retirement, end quote. The deliberate use of the word retirement immediately brings to mind a worker no longer able to be, or considered, productive. The replicants also represent the cynical, pre-planned obsolescence of consumer products, deliberately designed to break after a short period of use, so they must be repurchased. Fisher comments, quote, and the accelerated obsolescence of manufactured objects finds its ultimate expression in the 4-year programmed lifespan of the Nexus 6 replicant itself, end quote. The built-in obsolescence of consumer products was made explicit in Hampton Fancher's script of the 24th of July 1980, which contains a voiceover by Deckard commenting on the inevitable death of the replicant Rachel, saying, quote, the market worked on turnover. Built-in obsolescence was the name of the game. That meant her, too, end quote. This important statement was reintroduced in Deckard's voiceover in the theatrical cut, so it was directly accessible to the audience. This concept was also made explicit in the theatrical cut's narrative, in which Eldon Tyrell, head of the corporation which made the replicants, tells replicant Roy Batty, quote, you were made as well as we could make you, end quote, to which Batty insightfully replies, quote, but not to last, end quote, a statement demonstrating that he understands very well his limited lifespan was a deliberate decision. He was made with built-in obsolescence. Fancher himself has explained that the concept of built-in obsolescence was a fundamental part of the plot, commenting in an interview that the replicants' limited life, quote, had been deliberately designed into them by Tyrell, end quote, adding, quote, that was a conscious decision on my part from the very first scripts. In fact, I wanted to show this corporation including the same kind of built-in obsolescence in the androids that auto manufacturers put into their cars. So the idea from the beginning was that Tyrell had purposefully built in this breakdown so people would have to buy a new replicant every few years. He did that to keep his commerce running, end quote. So, ironically, the one fully intended reference to automobile manufacturers in Blade Runner has absolutely nothing to do with the US-Japan trade war or Japanese corporations taking over the US, but is instead a very intentional social criticism of unethical design practices by profit-motivated capitalists, specifically US car manufacturers. Blade Runner's genuine efforts to address all these social concerns were typically overlooked by both the original test audiences and the general viewing public when the movie was finally released. The low-key film noir aesthetic and plot did not combine well with the high-concept sci-fi narrative which was attached to it, resulting in long stretches of silence or minimal dialogue encoded in symbolic language which left viewers directionless, a flaw which Deckard's awkward post-production exposition narrative could not resolve, especially when it omitted to mention specific social criticism which had been explicit in earlier versions of the screenplay. Nevertheless, the social commentary and criticism Blade Runner had inherited from its source material, Dick's novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, was still embedded faithfully in the movie's final screenplay and its public production version, which Salmon calls, quote, the philosophical, ecological, and sociological concerns which Blade Runner faithfully transplanted from Sheep's impassioned heart, end quote. He goes on to write that the final version of the movie preserved the paranoia and alienation of Dick's novel, but, quote, also condemned mankind's emotional sterility. Tyrell creates people for slave labor, while indicting humanity's misuse of the Earth's natural resources, Blade Runner's ever-present acid rain and absence of real animals, end quote. Salmon concludes, quote, in short, Blade Runner was most faithful to Sheep where it really counted, end quote. We should also consider the interpretation of those involved in actually making the movie to see what they felt its main message was. Ridley Scott himself was insistent that the word android be avoided, despite it being in the title of the source material, because, quote, I didn't want Blade Runner to be premonitory of android at all, because then people would think that this film was about robots, when in fact it isn't, end quote. For Scott, Blade Runner's themes were far greater than simply a clash between human and machine. But of course, he said nothing about it addressing a trade war with Japan or fears of Japanese takeover. Producer and writer Ivor Powell likewise observed, quote, and although it's not mentioned specifically in the movie, it feels like Blade Runner implicitly warned us that the 21st will probably be the most dangerous century that mankind has ever faced. Now there's cloning and global warming, an increased division between the rich and the poor, an accelerated depletion of vast tracts of the Amazon rainforest, and the insanity of religious extremism and terrorism, end quote. Notice how Powell not only identifies very clearly Blade Runner's actual intended message, a collection of social and ecological concerns in the late 70s and early 80s, but also acknowledges this was, quote, not mentioned specifically in the movie, end quote, which I argue is one of the reasons why it has been misunderstood. Of course, Powell doesn't mention any trade war with Japan or fears of Japanese takeover. Producer Michael Dealey likewise commented that Blade Runner's intended message had what he called, quote, prophetic value, end quote, adding, quote, the bad weather, the ethnic changes, the inner city crumbling, the cloning, those things were really not on the list back in 1981, end quote. It should be noted that when he says not on the list, he doesn't mean these weren't grassroots social concerns in 1981. We have clear evidence that they were. Instead, he means they were not on the list of priorities for the government and other elites. He makes this very clear by adding, quote, "Yet here we are in 2017, very near the 40-year future that we'd imagined lay ahead of us when we made Blade Runner in 1982. And the concerns the film voiced are now at the top of the agenda," end quote. For Dealey, the social and ecological concerns which many people, and even elites, are now prioritizing had already been expressed decades ago in Blade Runner's intended message. Once again, we find no reference to any trade war with Japan or fears of Japanese takeover. More could be added, but I'll finish this section with some comments by actor and environmental activist Rutger Hauer, who played the replicant Roy Batty. Hauer was particularly moved by Blade Runner's theme of ecological destruction, commenting, quote, "I think Ridley and I both realized that, in reality, we were coming from a world that is going to explode and that is overpopulating," end quote. For Hauer, Blade Runner's social and ecological concerns were the intended message. He says nothing about any trade war with Japan or fears of Japanese takeover. Why has the Kavernacle made these mistakes? While watching TK's videos on Cyberpunk and Blade Runner, I've often asked myself, why does he think this way? Where is he getting this from? And in his first video, it's often unclear because he often simply doesn't explain why or cite any sources for his view. But when he does cite sources in both his first and subsequent videos, it's clear TK has an anachronistic view of Blade Runner because he has been misled by sources disconnected from Blade Runner's socio-historical context. He hasn't done original research using primary sources, and he hasn't validated his secondary sources. He hasn't checked them for accuracy. In all three of his videos on Cyberpunk, especially the second and third, he has relied on pop history and secondary sources for his literary analysis of both Cyberpunk as a genre and Blade Runner 1982 as a movie, adopting uncritically the claims and interpretations of people who lived and wrote over a decade after Blade Runner was released, and who themselves failed to read it in its original socio-historical context. His own interpretation is not only influenced by these sources, but by false assumptions he has about the movie. Now, I know some people might object, but TK is not wrong in his interpretation of Blade Runner. He's just using a different method of interpretation, which is equally valid, to arrive at a different interpretation, which is equally valid. For instance, they might suggest he's using social reader response theory, or say he's applying the concept of death of the author, both of which are methods of literary analysis which privilege the reader's personal interpretation of the text over the author's intention. But he demonstrably is not doing that. I've taught literary analysis and criticism courses for 6 years, including International Baccalaureate English Language and Literature, AP English Language and Literature, and AP English Literature and Composition. I'm very familiar with such analytical approaches as psychoanalytic criticism, critical race theory, various forms of reader response theory, death of the author, post-structuralism, Marxist analysis, and deconstructionism. But TK isn't using any of those. He isn't using anything exotic, nothing deconstructivist, post-structural, or completely subjective. He's using a very straightforward form of traditional socio-historical analysis. This is totally evident from the fact that he appeals repeatedly to specific social and historical events which he claims influenced the writing and development of both Cyberpunk and Blade Runner. Consequently, TK's interpretation of Blade Runner is based on his fact claims about the social and historical context of Blade Runner, claims which are objectively testable. There is nothing wrong with this method. On the contrary, this is textbook first-year level socio-historical literary analysis, which is taught in schools and universities as the standard approach to literary analysis, and it's where I start with all my students. It's the method I primarily use myself. The issue is that if you don't get the socio-historical background correct, the analysis you build on it will be fundamentally flawed. I've demonstrated that TK's claims about the socio-historical events which shaped Blade Runner are unsubstantiated and often even contradicted by the available socio-historical evidence. I've also disproved several of his claims about the origin of cyberpunk as a genre. In my next video in this series, I'll identify TK's errors about Asian representation in Blade Runner 1982 and address his concerns about Orientalism in the movie.